Imagine a gray dawn on May 19, 1643. The sky, covered by low clouds, barely lets any light through. In front of you, a French plain blanketed with smoke and dust. The echo of drums marks the march of thousands of men advancing in tight formation. The pikes at the front, muskets on their shoulders, and on their faces the determination of those who have seen death up close too many times. They are the Tercios of Flanders, the elite of the Spanish infantry, the same men who for over a century have made kings and republics tremble, men hardened by endless campaigns, from Italy to the frozen fields of the north. Today, however, they do not fight to conquer, but to stop the French advance and save the prestige of an entire empire. That day, near the small village of Rocroi, the Tercios face a young and confident enemy, led by a boy barely 21 years old, the Duke of Enghien. The French believe they will finally defeat the Invincibles. What they don't know is that, even on the verge of collapse, a Tercio never surrenders without fighting to the last drop of blood. The battle begins with artillery fire shaking the ground. The wings of the Spanish formation are hit by enemy cavalry, while the center, made up of Tercio veterans, holds firm. For hours, the Spanish soldiers resist attack after attack, forming the feared Pike Square, a human wall that neither horses nor infantry can break through. But the reality is cruel. The empire that supports them is exhausted. Reinforcements don't arrive, gunpowder runs out, and men start falling one after another. When the smoke clears, the plain is covered with bodies. Thousands of Spaniards have died, but their resistance was so fierce that even the French honor the fallen. Rocroi was not the end of the Tercios, but it was a warning. Times were changing. Weapons, tactics, and European alliances were evolving, and Spain, burdened by wars and debts, could no longer sustain the war machine that had made it master of the world for a century. And yet, that day the Tercios made something clear that no enemy would ever forget. A Spanish soldier might lose a battle, but never his honor. At the end of the 17th century, the world map still had large patches of red and gold, the colors of the Spanish Empire. From the Philippines to the Viceroyalty of Peru, from the ports of Naples to the fortresses of Flanders, all the territory was, at least in theory, under the same banner. And yet, that empire was beginning to creak from within. Maintaining the Tercios, that infantry feared throughout Europe, was a luxury the crown could no longer afford as easily as before. During the previous century, the military machine had been sustained thanks to the regular arrival of the Indies fleets. Galleons loaded with silver bars from Potosi, gold from New Spain, pearls, cocoa, silk, spices, a treasure that seemed endless. But the reality was different. Every time those ships arrived in Seville, much of the cargo was already committed before reaching the port. Genoese, Flemish, and German bankers had advanced astronomical sums to finance the monarchy's wars. And when the silver arrived, it went straight to paying debts and interest. What was left was divided among overdue salaries, upkeep of fortifications, artillery, and weaponry. Too often, what remained for the common soldier was nothing. Royal bankruptcies, a polite way to say, "we can't pay," became a chronic problem. Philip II declared them, Philip III repeated them, and Philip IV was no exception. And when the monarchy couldn't meet its creditors, the consequences were felt directly in the Tercios camps. Imagine being in a makeshift tent in a muddy camp in Flanders or Lombardy after weeks of marching. You haven't seen a coin of your pay for months. Your clothes are tattered, your boots full of holes, and the musket you hold has passed through more hands than you can count. The day's rations are hard bread, rancid cheese, and watered-down wine. Morale, which in better times was ironclad, begins to crack. Not everyone held on. Mutinies became more frequent. Groups of soldiers tired of waiting for their pay, refusing to march or locking themselves inside fortresses until they received what was promised. Sometimes, to calm the mood, officers gave part of their own money or promised loot in the next campaign, promises that were not always kept. Recruitment also started to deteriorate. In the 16th century, being part of the Tercios was a pride reserved for tough men, many with prior experience, who saw the service as a career and an honor. But by the late 17th century, the levies were filled with untrained peasants, recruited by force or drawn by the promise of pay that, if lucky, would come late. Veteran status was lost, and with it, the iron discipline that had been the key to so many victories. Meanwhile, enemies waged their own war outside the battlefield. France, Holland, and England didn't just fight with weapons. They attacked Spanish trade, intercepted fleets, blockaded ports, and cut supply routes. Every ship sunk meant less money for the king and fewer resources to equip his soldiers. Despite everything, many tercios kept fighting with the same determination as always. Even poorly paid, poorly fed, and with outdated weapons, their battlefield resistance amazed their opponents. But the wear was evident. Spain still had a strong arm, but that arm was chained by invisible bonds made of debt, politics, and misery. And the worst part was that the enemy approaching didn't wear a uniform. It was a profound change in the way war was fought, a change the tercios were not prepared to face. The 17th century was drawing to a close, and Europe was no longer the same place that had seen the birth of the tercios. On the battlefield, something deep was changing. The old closed formations of pikes and muskets, which for over 100 years had been the nightmare of any army, were beginning to be outmatched by new tactics. The tercios had been nearly invincible, largely because they combined three elements uniquely: iron discipline, a balance between firearms and melee weapons, and a formation that defended itself like a rock. The famous Pike Square could withstand cavalry charges, advance under enemy fire, and strike hard at the right moment. But this formula, which had worked perfectly in the 16th century, was beginning to show cracks. The armies of the north, especially the Dutch and the Swedes, had developed a different model. Inspired by the military reforms of Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, their units were smaller, more mobile, and far more dependent on continuous fire from muskets and light artillery. The pike, queen of close combat, was losing prominence to firearms. While a tercio square could be an almost impenetrable wall, it was also slow, difficult to maneuver, and very vulnerable to well-employed artillery. The Swedes and Dutch knew this. They preferred to deploy infantry lines that could fire in constant volleys, fall back, regroup, and attack again, gradually wearing down the enemy's morale and strength. Spain was not immune to this change. Its generals saw how old tactics were becoming obsolete. But the transition was not easy. By tradition, pride, and the army's very structure, it was hard to abandon what had brought so many victories. Changes were introduced. The number of pikemen was reduced. The proportion of musketeers increased. More importance was given to artillery, but always with one foot in the past. This gap was especially noticeable in the War of Spanish Succession, 1501–1714. For the first time, the forces fighting for Spain, both Bourbon and Habsburg sides, fully incorporated modern European tactics. The tercios, by contrast, were no longer the backbone of the infantry, but just one part of a transforming army. In battles like Almanza, 1707, the contrast was clear. The Bourbon victory was not solely the work of the old tercio tactics, but the result of a combination of cavalry, artillery, and infantry lines in the French style. The names of units also began to change. The term tercio was replaced by regiment, following the Bourbon motto brought from France. For veterans who had served under the old banners, this was almost a betrayal. The tercio was not just a military formation, it was a brotherhood, an identity. Changing it for a regiment was like tearing away part of the Spanish soldier's soul. But war is pragmatic. What doesn't work gets left behind. The decline was neither immediate nor absolute. For a time, units that still retained the spirit, and partly the structure, of the tercios survived, especially in overseas garrisons or frontier regions. But the military center of gravity in Europe had already shifted. The new war was faster, more dependent on firepower than on shock, more technical than heroic. And here lay the greatest problem. The tercios were a machine designed for warfare of another time. They could resist like no one else, assault walls or hold a position against all odds. But on an open field, facing a modern army, their task became increasingly difficult. Thus, little by little, the tercio stopped being the star of chronicles and became a glorious memory. A memory that still inspired respect, but no longer decided the fate of battles. As we entered the 18th century, the tercios were no longer what they once had been. Not because their valor had diminished, that remained intact, but because the world had changed too fast for them. The name tercio still appeared on unit rosters, but their organization, armament, and even their way of fighting were something else entirely. During the War of Spanish Succession, 1701–1714, many tercio veterans fought side by side with troops trained in the French or imperial style. Some units still retained the banner, spirit, and certain elements of traditional discipline, but the regiment structure was gradually taking hold. It wasn't just a change of name. It meant that the Spanish army was definitively adopting the modern military model, leaving behind more than a century and a half of tactical history. But even though the decline was inevitable, the tercios, or what was left of them, continued to fight fiercely in faraway theaters. In Italy, they defended strongholds and took part in sieges with the same stubbornness as always. In America, veteran garrisons fought against pirates, privateers, and rival powers trying to seize overseas domains. Even in North Africa, old tercio units kept watch over presidios like Melilla or Ceuta, resisting raids and uprisings. Each of these actions was somewhat anachronistic, battles fought with the spirit of another era in a world that spoke a different military language. Still, wherever a tercio veteran set foot, the enemy knew they were not facing just any soldier. The official disappearance came quietly, without a great final battle that could be called the day the tercios died. It was more an administrative and political process than a military one. With the Bourbon reorganization of the army, the old units were dissolved or transformed into regiments. Some retained part of their men, but under new flags. with new hierarchies and doctrines. For those who had served under the name Tercio, that was a blow harder than any defeat on the battlefield. It was the end of a brotherhood forged in blood, mud, and gunpowder. A tercio was not just a group of soldiers. It was a family where veterans taught recruits, where loyalty was owed not only to the king, but to the men who marched and slept beside you. Still, their legacy did not disappear entirely. During the 19th century, in the War of Independence against Napoleon, some volunteer corps adopted the name and colors of the old tercios as a symbol of resistance and national pride. They were not the same units, but they kept the memory alive. And by the 20th century, the Spanish Legion openly claimed their spirit, taking as a model their discipline, combat aggressiveness, and implicit motto of die before surrender. But strictly speaking of the regular army, the story was already written. The last official tercio had faded away into the pages of military records. There was no farewell parade, no final glorious charge. Its end was bureaucratic, almost invisible, and precisely for that, more sad. However, as long as someone speaks their name with respect, the tercios will remain alive. Because a soldier's history is measured not only by the battles he wins, but by the example he leaves for those who come after.
The official history says the tercios disappeared more than 3 centuries ago, that they were replaced by regiments, reorganized by the Bourbons, and dissolved on the paperwork of a ministry. And yet, if you close your eyes, you can still hear the echo of their footsteps, the creak of pikes, the crackle of a lit match igniting a musket. Because the tercios were not just a military unit. They were a symbol of what Spain could achieve when discipline, bravery, and brotherhood stood united on the same front. Their legacy lives on in 3 dimensions: in memory, in culture, and in military spirit. In memory, because their deeds are still told. Books, chronicles, and Golden Age romances have kept them from fading away. Authors like Lope de Vega or Calderón de la Barca made the soldiers of the tercios the protagonists of comedies, dramas, and verses. In those texts, the Spanish soldier appears proud, poor but dignified, ready to risk his life for his king and his brothers in arms. In visual culture, because art immortalized them, painters like Velázquez or Vicente Carducho captured their battles in portraits, with faces weathered by sun and campaigns, armor shining in the light of gunpowder. And even today, in parades, historical reenactments, or exhibitions, you can still see men dressed like them, with their doublets, morions, and flags waving in the wind. In military spirit, because the example of the tercios continues to influence how Spain conceives its infantry. The Spanish Legion, created in the 20th century, adopted much of their ethos: endurance of pain, speed in action, and unbreakable loyalty to the comrade. In their imagery, the legionnaire is heir to that pike and musket soldier who never backed down. But the legacy of the tercios goes beyond the army. It speaks of a way of understanding duty and sacrifice. It speaks of men who, often without resources, poorly paid and far from home, maintained discipline and faith in their mission. Men who knew they could die at any moment, but accepted that fate with their heads held high. Of course, one must also separate myth from reality. The tercios were not invincible, as Rocroi and other defeats clearly showed. They were not perfect, and their history includes episodes of mutinies, looting, and excesses. But even with those shadows, their effectiveness and resilience were extraordinary for their time. Perhaps that's why, when they are spoken of, the feeling is not just nostalgia,
but also pride. Pride in knowing there was a time when the Spanish infantry was the example to follow for an entire continent, that even in defeat, they earned the respect of their enemies. Today, more than 3 centuries later, the world is unrecognizable to those men. There are no longer pikes or morions, nor matchlock muskets. Wars are fought with drones, missiles, and technology they couldn't even imagine. But something has not changed. The idea that courage and loyalty never go out of style. And as long as in some conversation, some history lesson, some verse, or some military reenactment the word tercio is spoken, that brotherhood will keep marching invisible alongside us. The Spanish Tercios were not defeated by a single enemy. They fell to the passage of time, debts, and changes in the world. But as long as someone remembers their name, they will stand, firm, proud, eternal,